When engineers build a bridge, there are certain tests that are necessary for them to do. One of those tests, typically one of the final ones, is a load-bearing test. They will perform this test by loading containers filled with water onto the bridge to see how much weight it can bear until it strains. It's only under pressure that you discover whether a structure is sound or just merely beautiful. Today, we are starting our Lent series on the book of Job. The book of Job is about a man named Job from the land of Uz who honors God. We will read about his large family and prosperous estate, and so it's clear that Job is a wealthy man. The narrative then shifts from earth to a scene in the heavenly court where God is gathered with spiritual beings. Among them appears a figure referred to as the Satan, a Hebrew term meaning the adversary or accuser. God draws attention to Job as a man with integrity and righteousness. The accuser challenges this assessment, arguing that Job's devotion exists only because God has blessed and protected him. He insists that if those blessings were removed, Job would surely renounce God. Confident that Job's faith is not dependent on prosperity, God permits the adversary to bring suffering into Job's life, striking his family, his possessions, and eventually his health. We're actually going to read the first 2 chapters of the book of Job this week. So let's just take a look at that. We're going to read Job chapter 1 and all of chapter 2. And so it starts out by saying this. In the land of Uz, there lived a man whose name was Job. This man was blameless and upright. He feared God and shunned evil. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters, and he owned 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, and 500 donkeys, and had a large number of servants. He was the greatest man among all the people of the East. His sons used to hold feasts in their homes on their birthdays, and they would invite their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. When a period of feasting had run its course, Job would make arrangements for them to be purified. Early in the morning, he would sacrifice a burnt offering for each of them, thinking, "Perhaps my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts." This was Job's regular custom. One day, the angels came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came with them. The Lord said to Satan, "Where have you come from?" Satan answered the Lord, "From roaming throughout the earth, going back and forth on it." Then the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? There was no one on earth like him. He is blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil." "Does Job fear God for nothing?" Satan replied. "Have you not put a hedge around him and his household and everything he has? You have blessed the work of his hands so that his flocks and herds are spread throughout the land. But now stretch out your hand and strike everything he has, and he will surely curse you to your face." The Lord said to Satan, "Very well then. Everything he has is in your power, but on the man himself do not lay a finger." Then Satan went out from the presence of the Lord. One day when Job's sons and daughters were feasting and drinking wine at the oldest brother's house, a messenger came to Job and said, "The oxen were plowing and the donkeys were grazing nearby. And the Sabeans attacked and made off with them. They put the servants to the sword, and I'm the only one who has been able to escape to tell you." While he was still speaking, another messenger came and said, "The fire of God fell from the heavens and burned up the sheep and the servants, and I'm the only one who has escaped to tell you." While he was still speaking, another messenger came and said, "The Chaldeans formed 3 raiding parties and swept down on your camels and made off with them. They put the servants to the sword, and I'm the only one who has escaped to tell you." While he was still speaking, yet another messenger came and said, "Your sons and daughters were feasting and drinking wine at the older brother's house, when suddenly a mighty wind swept in from the desert and struck the 4 corners of the house. It collapsed on them, and they are dead, and I'm the only one who has escaped to tell you." At this, Job got up and tore his robe and shaved his head, and then he fell to the ground in worship and said, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised." In all this, Job did not sin by charging God with wrongdoing. On another day, the angels came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came with them to present himself before him. And the Lord said to Satan, "Where have you come from?" Satan answered, Satan answered the Lord, from roaming throughout the earth, going back and forth on it. Then the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one on earth like him. He is blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil. And yet he still maintains his integrity, though you incited me against him to ruin him without any reason." "Skin for skin," Satan replied. "A man will give all he has for his own life. But now stretch out your hand and strike his flesh and bones, and he will surely curse you to your face." The Lord said to Satan, "Very well, then he is in your hands, but you must spare his life." And so Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and afflicted Job with painful sores from the soles of his feet to the crown of his head. Then Job took a piece of broken pottery and scraped himself with it as he sat among the ashes. His wife said to him, "Are you still maintaining your integrity? Curse God and die." He replied, "You are talking like a foolish woman. Shall we accept good from God and not trouble?" In all this, Job did not sin in what he said. When Job's three friends, Eliphaz and the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite, heard about all the troubles that had come upon him, they sent out from their homes and met together by agreement to go and sympathize with him and comfort him. When they saw him from a distance, they could hardly recognize him. They began to weep aloud, and they tore their robes and sprinkled dust on their heads. Then they sat on the ground with him for 7 days and 7 nights. No one said a word to him because they saw how great his suffering was. Job is righteous before he suffers. And I think that's an important point to start out with. It's important because it can be thought that people suffer because of moral failure, right? You mess around and you find out. But here in the beginning of the book of Job, as the scene is being set, we see what it says in verse 1, right? It says, "In the land of Uz there lived a man whose name was Job. This man was blameless and upright. He feared God and he shunned evil." I mean, Job was blameless, okay? Now, this does not mean sinless, okay? Sinless means being entirely without sin, right? Only achieved by Jesus. While blameless refers to a reputation, to your integrity, or just to a person who has sought and really received forgiveness. And God here even calls Job a righteous person. And what this does is it dismantles a false belief, which I think is prevalent within the universal church, especially in kind of charismatic movements and in certain parts of our world. If you were to maybe turn on your TV on Sunday morning, it's probably promoted by the televangelists you may unfortunately see there. I'm sorry about that. But this belief is known as the prosperity gospel. The prosperity gospel is a quote-unquote Christian teaching that claims God guarantees physical health, material wealth, and personal success for believers who have sufficient faith, speak positive declarations, and give financially, especially giving to ministry leaders or churches, right? It presents blessing as a predictable spiritual principle, right? That if you believe rightly, you confess rightly, you give generously, God will reward you with prosperity. Prosperity gospel teaching uses phrases like, if you can name it, you can claim it. You have to give in order to get. You need to sow your first fruits of money in order to get what you really want. Right? It promotes the idea that if your life isn't going according to all the blessings I mentioned earlier, then it's because you haven't been faithful enough. But the beginning of Job dismantles this entire misplaced theology. Right? Job is going through loss without knowledge of why. And it's not because he was reaping some sort of consequence for something that he had done. Job is righteous in God's sight, and he ends up suffering and having things taken away, but it's not due to him not having enough faith. And this brings me to a theological framework that I would like us to understand as we start this series, as we're going to go through Lent. And that framework is comparing a theology of glory to a theology of the cross. Okay. Now let's get a working understanding of those two concepts. Okay. A theology of glory is an approach to Christianity and even to life that try to minimize difficult and painful things or to move past them rather than looking them square in the face and accepting them. It's the I can do it all if I just use my power, if I just have enough wisdom or people skills mindset. Theologies of glory acknowledge the cross, right? What Jesus accomplished on it and through it, and even what it means, but they view it mostly as a means to an end, right? An unpleasant but a necessary step on the way to personal improvement. A theology of glory is when your faith feels like a fight against harsh realities instead of a resource for accepting them. However, a theology of the cross defines life in terms of giving rather than taking, self-sacrifice rather than self-protection, dying rather than killing. It reorients us away from our natural tendency, which is to rely on ourselves and our skills. It points us away from a theology of glory by showing that we win by losing, that we triumph through death, and we become rich by giving ourselves away. Now, of course, our inner theologian of glory can be counted on to try to hijack the theology of the cross and make it new, a more reliable scheme for self-improvement. But the theology of the cross, right, that Jesus used evil to bring about the ultimate good, happens to us and actually in spite of us. And for the suffering person, one who's going through difficulty and trying to understand why, this is a word of profound hope. So a theology of glory assumes that blessing proves faith. A theology of the cross means that I can see God draw me closest in the midst of turmoil. Job's circumstances here shows us that you can be a respectable, faithful man or woman and have a calamity come upon you. But God is present in the midst of our circumstances and our pain. He meets us there because he's been there himself. Our text that we're looking at also shows us that there are dimensions to suffering that we always can't see. The accuser questions Job's motives, right? He puts Job's righteousness on trial. The interesting thing, though, is actually Job is unaware of this kind of courtroom showdown. I mean, Job's life is about to fall apart and he doesn't know why. Job finds himself living in mystery without any understanding of the meaning. You know, there can seemingly be silence in the midst of our trials. And it can be easy to think that we've been abandoned. Have you ever had those moments? Moments when the proverbial crap has hit the fan and you're asking the questions like why is this happening? Where's God and why is he not doing something? I mean, if we were to respond to those questions through a theology of glory, the answer would be that there must be something wrong with me or my posture or my faith as the explanation, right? Like I've not done enough and clearly this is my consequence. And so what do I got to do? I better double down. I better try harder and get right with God. So my scenario can change, right? I know it can be easy when faced with the sin of the world, whether it's sin of our own hands, that from others, or just sin that seems inexplicable, to think God has abandoned us. But that's why the cross is so important. When Jesus went to the cross as he was being crucified, he cried out in Matthew 27:46, my God, why have you forsaken me? And there's silence. There's no explanation. There's no visible rescue at this moment. If we were the ones who stood up looking at the cross at Golgotha, right, we would have said, God has failed. But the greatest act of salvation in history was unfolding through this apparent abandonment. If God can be most at work when he appears most absent at the cross, then Job's suffering cannot mean that God is gone. Mystery is not the same thing as meaninglessness. What we cannot see is not the same thing as nothing happening. So although Job's suffering looks like abandonment, God is nearer than ever. God also understands suffering and abandonment more than ever, which we can come to understand when we see the sacrifice of God on behalf of Job and humanity. The suffering of the righteous does not mean that God has failed. It reveals what faith is actually built on. A theology of glory says blessing proves God's favor. The cross says God is most at work when he seems absent. See, Job's faith is not destroyed, it's revealed. We do not need to minimize pain when we're going through it. The season of Lent begins here, in ashes, in mystery, in unexplainable loss. But the question is not, will God protect me from suffering? The question is, will I trust him when he does not? Faith is not believing God will keep the storm away. It is trusting him when it comes. The cross teaches us that God is most faithful when he appears most hidden. God did not abandon Job. God remembered Job as he came into this world through the incarnation of Jesus. Jesus remembered Job as he was crucified on that cross. And he remembered Job when he defeated the grave, and he will remember him when he will come again. You see, the uniqueness of Christianity is that God himself came down from perfection to suffer on behalf of those who have deserved justice. See, many religions offer explanations of suffering as an illusion, right? We find that in Eastern thought. Or that suffering is karma. It's the repayment of past deeds, like you find in Hinduism. Or that simply suffering is fate. Or simply that suffering is something, and we maybe hear this a little bit more in Boston, something that suffering is something to transcend through detachment. Christianity proclaims something radically different. That God enters suffering. That God does not merely observe pain. He takes on flesh and suffers in history through the person of Jesus. That at the cross, God is not experiencing suffering from a distance. He's experiencing it himself. God knows you. He knows your pain. He knows what it's like to face the hardest pains of life, and he did that for you because of his great love for you. See, that's the good news of the gospel, that God came into the world to do something once and for all the sin and all the pain in it. That God came to pay the penalty for the sin with his life because of his love, and he defeated the grave, which now offers us redemption. What an amazing God we have, church. Amen? Amen.